Right. Okay. Well, Johan is suggesting that we try the video. I think maybe what we'll do is make a start with Suparana, if that's okay, Claire.
Mm-hmm.
We'll just introduce ourselves. So I'm Fiona Noonan and have with me Claire Barnes, and we run the Environment, Natural Resources and Climate Change Study Group. And we've put together with Brock Bersalia, who's in the audience this morning, this panel on leadership in and for natural resource management. So natural resource management has been taken very broadly here. It was open to contributions, and so we've got presentations on water scarcity, farmer and herder clashes, some more sort of water focused governance presentations, and a couple this afternoon on mining. So the natural resource context is very varied in these two panel sessions, and different perspectives on leadership too, with probably quite an emphasis on local leadership. So we very much look forward to hearing from the presenters. And just to emphasize as well, we had a study group meeting on Wednesday, and it wasn't a sort of a massive turnout, but we had a fantastic discussion, because the study group has been thinking about and had some activities, and including a recent workshop on interdisciplinarity. So if you're interested in environment, natural resources, climate change anyway, please do get onto the mailing list and get involved, suggest activities that we could do, and get to know people and network through the mailing list. But also, if you're interested in this interdisciplinarity, and particularly in the role of social science in environment, ecological research, and the challenges associated with that, we've got some more exciting activities planned in that area. So I'm going to hand over to Claire, who's going to introduce the speakers, and I'll sort of deal with the questions a bit later. And I think, Claire, maybe you can give some housekeeping as well. Okay, I'll see you later.
Thanks, Fiona. Yes, so welcome everybody. As Fiona said, I'm Claire Barnes and I'm based at the University of Edinburgh. We had 6 speakers, as Fiona mentioned, so we've got 3 this morning, and then we'll be continuing with the panel this afternoon at 2 o'clock in session 8 with 3 more speakers. So the 3 speakers we have this morning will be listening first to Suparana Kachieni, who's going to be talking about leadership in water scarcity in India, followed by Felix Asada, just need to check that he has arrived, and Deepa Koshizeri, who's going to be talking about, firstly, Felix will talk about Nigeria, and Deepa will be talking about Kerala in India. So yeah, we've got, as I think with other panels, if you can use the text chat purely for technical questions, and Johan is the volunteer in this session, and he'll be able to hopefully help with any connection issues there. And if you want to ask a question, you can just use the question mark function or raise your hand. What we'll do is, depending on when the other speakers arrive, we'll have 20 minutes for the first presentation, and I'll bring Suparana to the stage for that, and then any clarifying questions after each presentation, so just some shorter questions on that. And then after we've had all 3, we'll bring all 3 speakers to the stage, and we can broaden out the discussion and maybe look for some comparisons across the presentations and across the contexts that everyone will be talking about. So let me remember how to do this, and I will just bring Suparana to the stage. Should be it. Let's see. There's a bit of a delay sometimes. Suparana, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great, fantastic. We can hear you. That's good. I'm just going to bring up your presentation here.
Thank you.
Let's see. This should be it coming. Yeah. So what we'll do, I'll just get rid of the welcome slide. I'll disappear to the side so that the audience just see you and the presentation, and just let me know when you want us to move on to the next slide. So if you just say next slide, I'll move through for you.
Sure. Thank you.
I'll disappear now, and I'll give you a sign when there's 5 minutes left so that you know.
Okay. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for thank you, Fiona and Claire, for enabling my presentation in this session. Let me just go on the emphasis mode for my presentation. Yeah. So I'm going to be presenting on leadership and mitigating water scarcity in India. This is part of my doctoral and postdoctoral research work. And I looked at whose leadership are we talking about, on what issues, and how should this leadership be supported. Next slide, please, Claire. Yeah. So before I talk a little bit about the leadership aspect, I would like to briefly give an overview of the water scarcity situation in India. If you see the map on the right, you can see that the northeastern part, the darker blue part, has low to moderate water scarcity. The central and eastern parts have moderate water scarcity with a lighter blue tone, and the northern and the southern part have moderate to high water scarcity, while the northwestern and the southern part have high water scarcity. So there is a spread of water scarcity in India, with very few of the parts experiencing low or no water scarcity. So this necessitates a look at how to mitigate water scarcity, and leadership in mitigation of water scarcity is an important aspect of that. So when we talk about whose leadership, I explored among the various stakeholder groups like the marginalized and vulnerable groups, communities, states, civil society organizations, or private sector, whose leadership is considered to be most important in the area of reducing water scarcity. Second aspect, when we talk about what aspects of water scarcity, now water scarcity has multiple dimensions, like it can be attributed through human water requirements, or considering the environmental requirements of water, or the water resources, vulnerability to climate change and anthropogenic activities, or we can look at water scarcity from the point of view of water access, water use, or the inclusion of different groups' priorities. So these are the different aspects of water scarcity, and I'll be talking about which aspects emerge as most important from the viewpoint of the communities and the other stakeholders whom I have interviewed. From the literature, water-related disasters risk reduction was also considered a very important aspect of water scarcity, and the particular authors are Virek and Vlanderen, who suggest that it is important to consider the disasters, for example, droughts and floods specifically. And when we look at how is the leadership shaped in India, I'm talking about the context-specific strategies that are actually in implementation. The different experiences of civil society organizations, the states, the communities in building up leadership, and what are the challenges that they face. Next slide, please. So this is, as I mentioned, this is based on my doctoral and postdoctoral research. So to emphasize, there were 3 studies during 2011 and 19. My doctoral work was on understanding the knowledge and governance gap on water scarcity mitigation, during which I did a policy review at the national and the subnational level. And this study involved the quantitative assessments of state water scarcity, which I presented as a map in the earlier slide, and qualitative analysis of water policies. The second study that I carried out was on women's participation in river and water management. So what I did was to conduct a qualitative research to gather women's voices from Brahmaputra River Basin in the northeastern part of India, which I showed in the map is actually experiencing low water scarcity, but experiences very high frequency floods, recurrent floods every year. And this was a qualitative research. The third research was on understanding development organizations' role of representing the vulnerable to disaster risk. This was also a qualitative research carried out in the eastern and western part of India. Eastern part, as I shared, experiences moderate water scarcity, and the western part is actually experiencing high water scarcity. So we have viewpoints from both these areas. And this study was the recent, it was carried out in 2018 and 19, and leadership probably was not in the first stage of aspect that I was looking at, but it actually emerged as an important aspect in all these three studies. So I have insights from all the three studies on the leadership for mitigating water scarcity, which I'll be sharing with you in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So the first finding was that women's leadership is really important and is missing. So probably the font is very small to read, but I have quotations from the field work here, and I'm emphasizing only a few points in the interest of time. The first point is that the women's leadership is actually only restricted to village or panchayat level, which is the most decentralized level in India. So it is not found at a higher level. It is only limited to a smaller or a decentralized level. Second is, it is considered now very important in the context of out-migration from the rural areas because of water scarcity, and the migration is mainly of men. So women are actually having a lot of information and knowledge of the area, more knowledge about looking after the other vulnerable groups. So their leadership would actually bring in contextual and experiential knowledge and socio-cultural priorities, because the socio-cultural context is very, very important in India when we look at leadership or in terms of actually addressing any natural resource governance issue. The aspects on which women's leadership is important is gender-specific issues. For example, in disaster relief packages, there is no consideration of menstrual hygiene of women during floods. And that is missing because women's leadership is missing. So at present, if you see the evaluation of water resources management program and disaster risk reduction programs, these are largely gender blind. There are only a few inclusions of gender specific issues. Second aspect is women as keepers of traditional knowledge and managers of resources. So when we talk about resources here, specific to the context of India, women largely do not manage financial resources, and that is why their leadership or their inclusion in decision making is also not considered very relevant, because the financial, they are excluded from ownership or management of financial resources. This is coming from the narratives of women from the Brahmaputra River Basin. The third aspect is, which is also linked to this earlier point, is women's ownership and control of resources and ownership of land and financial resources. These findings also resonate with the earlier literature, like Addison et al. In 2019 mentions that control, leadership, empowerment, and independence of indigenous groups and women is very important in development. And this is in reference to Sain's work on development as freedom. Second relation with literature is Jalal's finding that women leadership leads to improved water security and greater efficiency. So for these, the aspects that need to be looked at in the context of India are actually women's ownership and control of resources. So the most insights that I received in the field work was on how the leadership of women needs to be encouraged. First is creating scale of influence at the grassroots level. So as I mentioned earlier that women leadership is restricted to village level, this is the first scale of influence because they are actually participating in decision making at that level. Second is not only creating the space at the grassroots level, but build it at different levels. So creating the space for their voices at different levels. And you can see that in the quote. I'm not going to read it in the interest of time, but I guess the presentation will be there for a reference and also sharing your views with me later on. So the resonance with the literature was that Montalvo and Elliott mentioned that it is very important to encourage leadership of women because there is collective intelligence and knowledge of citizens, and women leaders are needed at all levels of society. This is also supported by Jala. The third strategy is overcoming the barriers and building negotiation skills of women. So Warner in his work on multi-stakeholder platform mentions that these multi-stakeholder platforms are institutional bargaining space. And in my field work, what came out was women are hesitant to contribute to the discussions in these platforms because they feel that they lack the negotiation skills. So building negotiation skills would be important for building women's leadership. And the last point is women are actually heading the decision-making process in Arunachal Pradesh in the form of, like governing the local institutions. They are called Gaon Buris, which translates to village elderly women. So there are a few cases of decision making by women, but they are very, very few. Next slide, please. So one of the important lacking point in building women's leadership is their lack of time. So if you can see in this figure, I have captured a few photographs of what women's time is actually going into. So this is specific to the rural areas in Assam and Arunachal. And as you can see, they are busy in agriculture, childcare, fishing, building houses, weaving, and other activities. The first important insight that they gave was, where is the time to participate in the meetings? Because when the meetings are held to actually hold a decision, they are engaged in these activities. So it's important to consider how their time is allocated in a day, particularly in the rural area, to enable their leadership in decision making. Next slide, please. And one more insight that came out was from the field work is that, the range of or the level of participation. So this is a framework given by Beena Agarwal in her 2001 study on participatory exclusions, community forestry, and gender. And this framework is actually also relevant for water scarcity mitigation or women's participation in river management or water management. So this particular person, Kherepe Meme from Arunachal Pradesh, could actually identify the level of participation she's able to go for. For example, in the chart, you can see the nominal level of participation refers to only membership in the group. And the most advanced level of participation is actually interactive, empowering, and it is characterized by having a voice and influence in the group's decisions, holding position as office bearers. But she identifies that the current level of participation of most of the women from the rural areas in Arunachal Pradesh have a consultative level of participation. That is, being asked an opinion in specific matters, but there is no guarantee that it will influence the decision. So how to make the move from consultative to interactive level is something I'm looking for. And I look forward to your suggestions or any insights on that. Next slide, please. So not only women's participation is important or women's leadership is important, communities' leadership is also very important. So from the fieldwork, what emerged as important is leadership of vulnerable and marginalized groups, and in particular in India, Dalit group, who are historically disadvantaged group and are excluded from many of the decision-making meetings. And when we say communities, it is important to understand the heterogeneity of community. So there are various social subgroups in a community. Some groups are able to build leadership faster than the others. So it is very, very important to look at the vulnerable and marginalized groups' leadership, whose leadership is slowly evolving, but it is at a very, very a nascent stage. These are the insights from Bihar, which is in the eastern part of India and experiences floods and has moderate water scarcity. So on what aspects of water scarcity do we need communities' leadership? It is the ownership and inclusion in decision making. And as most of the communities are depending on natural resources for their livelihoods, it's important to look at leadership in that and also knowledge dissemination. So leaders from a community are seen as a communication link. And how are communities' leadership being built in India is basically by balancing gender and social inequalities, by empowering the vulnerable and marginalized communities and sensitizing them about their rights. So there is this quote where the CSO shared, or the civil society organization shared, that mixed group discussions with both men and women plus mixed group discussions with all the different social groups within a community are actually very important to build this leadership and understand the dynamics. Second important aspect on building leadership is continuous interaction with the communities. And third is capacity building programs on various aspects, and these are mostly need-based, what the community needs. Next slide, please. Third important group is state, and the state's leadership is considered to be important because water is a state subject in India, and the civil society organization claims that state is not a monolith. At certain level of governance, it is more, it's easier to create an influence, for example, at the national level and at the state level, but it is very, very difficult to actually create an influence at the district level. And on what aspects do we need states' leadership is in terms of sustainability, water security and sustainability. Next slide, please. I want to show two figures and then come back to this one. So here I bring back the map with the water scarcity level on the left, and on the right is a map of interstate virtual water flows. Virtual water flows are the embedded water flows in food production. And water scarcity is linked with it because food production consumes most of the water resources in India. So here you can see the red circle. These are the areas where most of the food grains are produced, and the green circles are the areas for which the food grain is being produced. So as you can see on the left hand side figure, the green zones are actually not facing so much of water scarcity, but the producing zone, the red zone, is highly water scarce. So we need leadership of both these group of states, the states where the water scarcity is high and is producing food grains, that needs to help the other green zone states to build their leadership to take up the activity of food grain production, so the mitigation of water scarcity can happen. Can you please go back to the previous slide? So I've explained the first point on the how through these maps. The second point is the state also needs to build leadership of civil society organization by inviting innovative solutions. At the moment, there is disconnection between the civil society organizations innovating and also research institutes innovating, but the state's recognition of these innovations. And the third point that is from the literature is that the commitment from the government agencies to the changed practices needs to continue. Otherwise, it creates a void. This I found really relevant in the context of India because the focus keeps shifting. So there needs to be a continuous commitment. So these are the findings. Can we go on to the conclusion slide, please? Yes. So in the context of India, the key words for building leadership are inequality, both in water endowments in the regions and also the social aspect, the economic aspect. Second is the representation of the groups who are marginalized and vulnerable. Their leadership is built through their representation and through their empowerment, and also understanding the power relations. So the four key conclusions that emerge from this work is that leadership depends on the specific context, like the state, women group, and the communities have leadership in the different aspects. Second is leadership is emerging but at a slow pace. It really needs policy emphasis to strengthen it further. The third is the need for synergy of bottom-up and top-down leadership. For example, the state's leadership is more top-down, while the community and women groups is more bottom-up. There is a need for synergy between the groups, so the fragmented flow of knowledge can be bridged. And the last is creating leadership always good? There were a few quotes on like when people go into the village, the civil society organization, they have to really go calmly and not as a leader, because if they go as a leader, then people will not listen quietly. So basically it has a negative connotation in some context. So I'm exploring this aspect, and it is mentioned in literature by Ivan et al. That leadership is typically depicted as an unequivocal good, and its importance is often asserted rather than tested. So the positive aspect of leadership needs to be tested. And here I would like to also hear from the audience if they would like to suggest something. And last slide, please. So these are the references if you would like to have a look. And the next slide. And I carried out these 3 studies in IIT Guwahati, in Wageningen University, IIT Delhi, and International River Foundation. Here are the references where you can find a little more detail about these studies. And the maps that I shared were from the first 2 references. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Suprana. That was really really interesting. I'm sure there'll be other aspects that come up and kind of similarities with the other presenters as well, not only in South Asia, but maybe especially the ones from South Asia in the context that you're talking about. So thank you very much. I just want to ask if there are any immediate clarification questions from the audience, or any kind of immediate thoughts or suggestions for Suprana. I'll leave that a second, otherwise we'll move on. There's somebody with their hand up, which is fantastic. Just stop that one. Can you hear us, Isaac?
Hi, yeah, so thank you for your presentation. I think it's very interesting. So you did mention that at the state level, there's some kind of limitation in terms of opportunities for women to lead. I think it would be perhaps interesting in terms of your future research to kind of want to know why there is generally that kind of limitation for women at the state level compared to maybe the district or community level. But you did also mention that there are a few instances where women participation at the state level, with particular regard to Arunachal Pradesh, is kind of, impressive, So I believe you could also maybe in terms of future research, explore subnational, when I say subnational, I mean at the state level, subnational variation in terms of women participation in discussions around the management of water scarcity. I think if you are able to do that, perhaps that would kind of, give you some insights as to how to move from the consultation level to the interactive level. Yes. Yeah, these are my immediate thoughts on your presentation.
Is that okay, Suparna?
Yeah. Thank you so much for your suggestion. I just noted it down and I was thinking about it. So, yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you. There's another hand here. I'll just quickly bring Kaustav up as well. Kaustav, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Great.
Hi, Suparna.
Hi, Kaustav.
As you know, I belong from Nepal. And I was thinking, as you move to the leadership to the state level, as most of the water projects, the water scarce area you showed in the map, they look like they belong from UP, Uttar Pradesh, and Uttarakhand. And most of the water source in that region goes from Nepal. And there are large water supply projects, irrigation projects. The water is diverted from Nepal as irrigation to the India. And do you have any thought of looking the leadership at the national level or looking at the transboundary level? Do you have thought on that?
I think that's very interesting. I mean, I would really like to look at the transboundary issue, but yes, I need like a co-researcher or some collaboration, because maybe we can collaborate on that and explore how Nepal and India can jointly build leadership. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your question, Kaustav and Isaac. So I think now we have Felix, the next presenter. So I'll just move you back to the audience, Suparna, and we'll put Felix in your place. Thank you. Hello, Felix. Can you hear us?
Yeah, hello. I can hear you.
Fantastic. Great. And we can hear you well. So that's fantastic. I'll just load up your file here. So we have 2 files with your name on. So I'll put this one up and you can let us know if it's the correct one. Is this the correct file?
That's the paper. Then the other one, the PDF, would want to be used today.
Okay, fantastic. There are 2 PDFs. I'll stop that one and bring the other one up. Okay. It's just loading. It's maybe got a large file size, so it's just loading. So as with Suparna, you have 20 minutes, and I'll give you a sign when there's 5 minutes left of your 20 minutes. So we'll just check that this is working first before I disappear. There we go. Is that correct? Can you see that?
Yes, please.
Okay, great, fine. I'll move to the side. So you can start, Felix, and I'll let you know when there's 5 minutes remaining.
Okay. So I start now?
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for coming. My name is Felix Ashade, and I am presenting on my behalf and on behalf of Dr. Agbalajobi. This study is about the farmers and herders clashes in Nigeria, and it has come to the point where so many researchers have gone into it. A lot of work has been done in the past, and this has to do with the use of land. Like we know, land is scarce. Can we please go to the next slide, please? We all know that land is so scarce anywhere in the world. And this is kind of simple economics that everybody realizes that land is natural and it cannot be produced in factories. And the demand for land is in high, when you compare the demand to the supply of land, we know that land is in high demand compared to its supply. And that brings the result of scarcity. And that means, of course, that when there is scarcity, like we know, there will be rationing among many potential users. And this leads to competition for land use. However, that shouldn't have been a problem. But in the case of farmers and herders in Nigeria, the struggles over land has become so dangerous, and it has led to physical conflicts, resulting to deaths. And clashes between farmers and herders are not new. Can we please go to the next slide? And they are not new. They are so much research into. People have gone into different areas of Nigeria to find out exactly what has caused this. So what we know already is from literature and what we see and read on newspapers. And the enormity of all this, the magnitude of all these clashes and the futile efforts to resolve these clashes are well documented by researchers. Next, please. This study is exploratory and it is qualitative. It, however, brings in a new dimension, the leadership dimension, by examining the applicability of leadership principles to the crisis. Next, please. The problem we are dealing with here is the ongoing and lingering farmers and herders clashes in Nigeria and how to find a solution to it. And our hypothesis is such that we propose that, one, the lack of leadership is responsible for the persistence of the phenomenon we are dealing with. At the same time, it is also such that we would like to find out if the path-goal theory of leadership can fix the problem and help stop the clashes. The choice of the path-goal theory is somehow random, but it is attractive because of how specifically it can be applied to different leadership situations. Next, please. Next. Now, the research questions. The next, please. The research questions that we have are 3. And can you please go back to the last one? Thank you. Now, we have 3 research questions. One is to find out the role of commerce, religion, and ethnic politics in the farmers and herders clashes. 2 is to find out the role or absence of leadership absence of leadership in farmers and herders clashes. And 3, to find out, like we mentioned earlier, if the path goal theory of leadership can be used. So those are the research questions that we had. Next, please. So we want to look at the significance of this study. There have been previous researches, like uncountable, if you can say so. And most of these researches in the past have concentrated on transactional, socio-political, and even ecological factors. This study agrees with previous researchers on their findings, but offers a leadership dimension to the subject matter. The leadership dimension should help to understand why the people are fighting, why the problem lingers, and also to chart a possible way out. And the theoretical framework of this study is based on the path goal theory and on Gurr's frustration and aggression theory. First of all, the Gurr's frustration aggression theory, Gurr 2001, of course, this was actually from his book in 1970. And this theory provides for the basis for which we can pin all these clashes. What caused these clashes? So we use the Gurr's frustration aggression theory for that. And then secondly, the path goal theory of leadership propounded by House in 1971. And that provides a possible solution to the crisis. As a starting point for this study, we reviewed existing literature on the farmer and herders clashes. Next, please. A review of literature shows different causes of conflicts. Researchers like Blanche, Abbas, Olayoku, they adduced a mixture of economic and ecological reasons to the farmers and herders' deadly clashes. And these reasons are the results of land rationing earlier mentioned, due to problems of land being limited in supply. And of course, desertification. Olayoku pointedly made it clear that the clashes are becoming increasingly dangerous and that the government's response has been inadequate. Furthermore, Ogwanamam adduced climate change as the basic cause of the clashes. And this supports the view of Hickman, who adduced land degradation as the cause of the conflicts. On the other hand, Gregson saw religion as a significant contribution or contributor to the clashes. Adekunle and Adisa, as well as Odo and Chigozie, they narrowed the causes of the conflicts to insensitivity and frustration. Next, please. With all these reasons given, next slide, please. Thank you. With all these reasons given by various researchers, what then is the real issue? Farmers need land for their crops. Herders need the same land for their cattle. Desertification and land degradation pushes herders to move their cattle in search of grassland. They move their cattle through farms and destroy crops. Farmers are deprived of their crops and become frustrated. And according to Gurr, 1970, prolonged relative deprivation results in anger and could lead to violence. Herders feel deprived of grassland and they are equally frustrated. The results are deadly clashes. The real issues are frustration and relative deprivation. Next, please. Now, these farmers and herders clashes have led to several deaths. So all these have effects in terms of lives being lost, properties being lost. And in 2018, for example, Al Jazeera reported a loss of 3,600 lives in that year alone, as well as loss of properties and investments. Ofoku and Isife documented the effects of this crisis as increase in crimes, internal displacements, widowhood, orphanhood, and other social disruptions. Next, please. So far, that is what researchers found. However, this study is introducing the land leadership dimension, as mentioned. Land leadership is a variant of leadership. So what is leadership and what is land leadership? Leadership theorists like Cole, Robbins and Coulter, Northhouse, Weirich et al., and others agree that leadership is a process of using power to influence stakeholders towards common goals. Next, please. And this brings us to look at the application of leadership to land. Is leadership applicable to land use? As mentioned earlier, leadership is a process of influencing stakeholders towards common goals. And it's applicable where three conditions are present. One, where there is an influencer, someone who has power to influence. Two, where there are stakeholders, where there are followers. Then three, where there are common goals. Then leadership process can set in. In the current situation of the farmers and herders, the first condition is met because there are stakeholders who are farmers and herders and other land users. And of course, they have a common goal, which is economic prosperity. And then there is power to influence. The government has power to influence the use of land by the virtue of the Land Use Act 1978. Therefore, a leadership process is applicable in the current situation. In other words, land leadership is possible. What then is land leadership on its own? In its simplest form, it is the application of leadership in land use. In line with agreed definition of leadership, as earlier mentioned, that is a process of influencing stakeholders, this study defines land leadership as the process of using power to influence land stakeholders to use available land in specific ways for the common purpose of economic prosperity. And there are several leadership theories, but specifically this study examined the path goal theory of leadership and its applicability to land leadership. Next, please. Next, please. Is land leadership something that the path goal theory can really address? In other words, is path goal theory applicable? Now, In 1971, House came up with the path goal theory, and that specifies 4 leadership situations and behaviors. The achievement-oriented behavior, which focuses on the results rather than the process or the followers. The directive behavior, which focuses on giving instructions where the followers depend on and obey the leader. And then supportive behavior, where the leader concerns himself with the well-being of the followers and seeks to support their activities. And finally, participative behavior, which creates a rapport between the followers and the leader. And this ensures the engagement of followers through ideas and decision inputs. Next, please. So, is this path goal theory applicable to land leadership? We mentioned 4 leadership behaviors. Are these applicable to land leadership, especially as we are looking at the farmers and herders clashes? Whichever of the 4 path goal behaviors used, North House in 2007, it submitted that leaders help their followers by charting a path for them and by removing obstacles from their path so that they can achieve their goals. In this farmer and herders situation in Nigeria, the Nigerian government can chart the course for the farmers and herders. The Nigerian government can remove obstacles on their paths. Therefore, it is possible to apply the path goal theory to land leadership in Nigeria. Next, please. A quick look at our methodology here. As mentioned earlier, this is a qualitative study, and we utilize the interviews and focus group discussions. This study used purposive sampling, where it was predetermined to select participants for the interview and the focus group discussion from among farmers, herders, religious leaders, and community leaders. A total of 200 questionnaires were delivered in 10 states of Nigeria. The responses from the questionnaires formed the basis for further investigations using focus group discussions of 10 participants per state. The 10 selected states were chosen not only because they have reported cases of clashes in the media, but also because some of them are contiguous to states with such clashes and serve as representatives. The 5 states selected in the northern part of Nigeria are Benue, Plateau, Niger, Kaduna, Kano. And the 5 selected in southwest Nigeria are Kwara, Osun, Oyo, Ekiti, and Ogun. Next slide, please. This shows the there was supposed to be a map. Pardon me, there is no map showing there. Anyway, it would have shown the map of Nigeria, of the north and the south, just to show these 5 states from the north and the south. And what are our findings? This study found that commerce, religion, and ethnic politics play roles in the conflicts, and thus confirm earlier findings of other researchers. Secondly, there is no land leadership. There is no process of land leadership, but there are regulations. 97% of focus group discussants found that there is no process of influencing the stakeholders, who in this study are the farmers and herders. No way of influencing them to use the land in prescribed ways and for specific purposes. This study also found that the path goal theory can be used to provide land leadership. 94% of the focus group discussants agreed that the path goal theory is a useful tool for land leadership purposes in Nigeria, and that each of the 4 leadership behavior options is applicable at different stages. Additionally, about the cattle colony that was proposed by the government to solve the problem, 78% of the discussants are against the establishment of cattle colonies. It's a private business and should be funded from private purses, they said. Next, please. And this study came up with some recommendations, and they are as follows. One is that the government should embark on land leadership and go beyond land management. Two, that the government should undertake proper economic analysis of land use beyond partisanship. Three, that the Southwest, where there is grassland, should be encouraged to produce hay and transport same to the north, where the cattle reside. Four, the Fulani herdsmen who live in the north could also get involved with hay planting by coming to the south to plant if they wanted to. There is no need to move cattle around. And then five, the path goal theory of leadership should be considered for use to provide land leadership. And finally, this study concludes, next please, that the causes of the farmers and herders clashes reported by previous researchers are correct. But those causes earlier reported are secondary to the land leadership failure that has been unearthed. The real reason why there are problems is because there has not been land leadership. This study also concludes that path goal theory of leadership is helpful in providing land leadership in Nigeria. And finally, that there is no need for cattle movement if the government removes the obstacles of degradation from the path of the herders and farmers. Thank you. Next, we have the list of references. You can please find out more about the farmer and herders clashes in Nigeria, more references also. And then we want to thank you for coming. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Felix, for that. And also for sticking perfectly to time as well, which is great, thank you. I just want to see if there are any immediate questions from the audience, and then we'll, after the third video presenter that we have, we can bring everybody, all the speakers back up as well. But we have an immediate question from Julian, so let me just try and bring this up. So Julian here has a question. Given that multiple communities, it's there. Given that multiple communities and ethnic groups are involved in farmer-herder conflicts, is it not rather a question of having an institutional framework for negotiation and mediation? So I guess, is an institutional framework different to the kind of path goal theory leadership that you've been talking about there?
Thank you very much for that question. When we talk of these conflicts, yes, it involves different communities from different ethnic groups, from different religions, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to navigate. It's possible to bring people together to try to solve this problem, but then that will just be resolving conflicts. It doesn't solve the problem. The problem is not that there has not been land management or an institutional framework there is land management. There are land management policies. But the difference is that land management policies are made out of rules. And these rules don't take into consideration this kind of relationship that leadership would offer. Leadership will be a process. Land management that is in place is a system. So the process that will move this crisis out of the present abyss now is to get people to relate, where someone will be the leader, charting the path, removing the obstacles, stage by stage. That is why this path goal theory will be more useful. Now, talking about institutional frameworks, yes, people can come together, like I said earlier, but the problem is that it doesn't solve the problem. It will only people talk, it doesn't solve the basic problems, because all the while, people have concentrated on what caused the problem. Oh, it's economic issue, religious issue, then you bring people together to resolve those problems. While the real problem is leadership. So institutional framework cannot solve the problem of leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. And we just have one question from Isaac. I'll just bring him up.
Hi, Felix. Good morning, and thank you for your presentation. I think it's a very interesting topic to look at. But my immediate thoughts kind of border on the link between the various theories that you highlighted and the main argument that you focus on. It seems to me that your main argument is that there is a failure of leadership that actually explains why there are farmers and herders clashes in Nigeria. But then when you go back to look at your theories, you seem to be grappling with different kind of theories that, are not quite in consonance with your main argument. So you mentioned the frustration, aggression kind of theory, but you also mentioned the leadership theory, but then you talk about the path goal theory. But it seems to me that your main argument here is about leadership problem. And so I would recommend that maybe you kind of be a little bit kind of consistent in terms of the theory, and I think you've done a very good empirical kind of analysis, but there is some kind of gap between which of the theory that we are using to kind of back up your main argument. It seems to me that you are drawing hugely on your leadership theory more than the frustration aggression theory, in kind of trying to explain your main argument. And finally, you made mention of the fact that in terms drawing upon the path goal theory, you argue that the Nigerian government can reduce the land use conflict. I think the question that most people will be interested in is that why is the Nigerian government, not interested in addressing the land use conflict, even though it does seem to have the capacity or the capability in reducing that conflict. So I think maybe in terms of the future, you might want to know the underlying political forces that kind of, shapes the way the Nigerian government handles, if you like, in your own ways, manages, the land use conflict rather than, demonstrating leadership that can bring about a lasting solution.
Okay, thank you. Do you want a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, you can give a response if you want to.
Okay, thank you very much, Isaac. Well, I'll make this clear. There is no conflict in what has been presented in terms of the theories. I will explain. Now, we have cause of something, the causative factors. That is where we brought in Ted Gurr's theory. Now, you remember that, you will know that the frustration aggression theory itself existed before Ted Gurr brought in his own dimension to it. The frustration aggression theory argues that violence comes from frustration and then leads to aggression. So we talk of the frustration aggression mechanism. But Gurr, he moved it forward and claimed that frustration leads to violence where there is prolonged relative deprivation. So Ted Gurr said that it is not just frustration that leads to aggression, but it is when it is prolonged relative deprivation. And according to Gurr, relative deprivation results in anger and leads to violence. And what did he call relative deprivation? Is the gap between what can be and what is. So in mentioning Gurr's theory of frustration and aggression, it was used to determine the cause of the problem. Is because people are frustrated, is because people feel that they have relative deprivation. That is the importance of bringing Gurr into that. While we don't want to keep on talking about, oh, the cause, the effects, what are the solutions? So on the other part now, that is where this land leadership theory, the path Gurr theory now comes in. So there is no conflict, because before we can begin to talk of path Gurr theory of leadership, we need to first of all know what leadership is. So talking about leadership theory is just to make a definition of what leadership is, which is the process of influencing, using power to influence people towards a particular goal. Now, the application of leadership principle can be used using any of the theories of leadership. But this study used the path Gurr theory. So I don't see where there is anything that is confusing. But if you want to ask a clearer question, maybe I will be able to say something about that.
I think for purposes of time, maybe I will look at it after everyone has presented.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Isaac. And it might be nice for you to continue the conversation later. Yeah. So if we just thank you, Felix, for now, and we'll try and bring you back on if we have time after we've heard from Deepa, our final presenter. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire.
Great. So our next and final presenter is Deepa Koshisera. And she is going to be talking about Kerala in South India. So Deepa has sent in a video. So I'm just going to load up her video now. And do let us know in the text chat if the quality of the video is okay for you. So if you don't mind giving us some feedback in the text chat just to make sure it's okay.
Hello everybody. Hello everybody. This presentation is on the challenges and possibilities for strengthening local governance in Attapadi Hills, Kerala, South India. The Attapadi Hills of the Western Ghats in South India has had a long period of afforestation, conservation and other development projects. The Kerala government's developmentalist efforts have accelerated the transformation of indigenous or Adivasi swidden cultivators to sedentarized cultivators and small farmers of cash crops. This presentation deals with the problematic of why there is no Adivasi ownership or leadership of these development projects. It discusses evidence of leadership in the context of natural resource management in Attapadi Hills, challenges to leadership, forms it takes, and discusses the potential for transformation. It finally argues for a close reading of the transformation and role of actors, as well as linking local struggles to food and climate justice movements. Kerala state in southwestern India has one of the most interesting development trajectories in the world. Kerala model of development refers to low economic development coupled with high social development indicators on health and literacy. There have been feminist critiques of the Kerala model of development as social reform did not improve and even limited women's access to resources. Adivasis are also outliers of development in Kerala. Attapadi Hills are part of the Western Ghats rainforest, one of the biodiversity hotspots of the world. A new species of frog endemic to the Western Ghats was found in Attapadi Hills. It is a new addition to the genus Valcarena in more than a century. It is indigenous homeland to Irula, Muduga and Kurumbar communities. In early part of the 20th century, they were the sole inhabitants of Attapadi Hills. With settler influx from the 50s, today Adivasis are just 35% of the population. The new frog species is called Valcarena Muduga, or the Muduga leaping frog, after the Muduga community. My thesis adopts a development studies and political ecology framework. Tanya Marie Lee's work in Sulawesi found that programs for welfare never meet intended outcomes. Development devises a narrative to connect the proposed intervention to the problem it will solve. The technical solutions are found for technical problems. Political decisions about allocation of resources, the political decisions that are made about allocation of resources made Ferguson call development anti-politics. Development practice is the product of social relations of power rather than carefully developed policies, according to Moss. My thesis is an investigation into agrarian distress in this indigenous homeland. This presentation is on evidence and challenges of emerging leadership in natural resource management. It contributes to bringing indigenous worldview and political action together for NRM. Methodology. I did semi-structured interviews, immersive ethnography, collected oral histories, informal conversations, forest and village walks, a few household surveys and few FGDs. I made use of storytelling and testimonies, sought permission from Adivasi chiefs and others. My finding. Clan authority has been replaced by state mechanisms like promoters. Adivasi clan system has weakened considerably. Among Attapadi Adivasis, the village headman is the Mopan. He is assisted by 3 treasurers or the Vandari, 2 revenue officers or Karutalas, and 1 agricultural officer or the Mandukaran. Territorial jurisdiction is based on clan authority. Several households in the Uru or village come under Adivasi administration. Clan leadership helped in food distribution and settlement of disputes. The state promoters have weakened authority of Adivasi clan leadership. Local political leaders have also intervened to weaken the Adivasi clan leadership. Here you see the headman and his wife of Anavai village. NRM leadership and collapse of conservation. Tribal involvement in development projects was only as wage labor. Village council was dominated by political parties who were contractors. With the Mandukaran or the agricultural officers' role weakening, seeds are not preserved today and grains not distributed to those with poor harvests. With the weakening of community Adivasi governance systems, their interest in ensuring health of forests, commons, water bodies has also decreased. New forms of leadership. As a consequence of afforestation efforts, there has been a creation of nature clubs, and some of the Adivasi women have grown up being part of this. This has shaped their indigenous identity. The challenges are that these nature activists do not have decision-making powers and do not have much support from their communities in organic cultivation. In the meanwhile, traditional healing has become commercially viable in Attapadi, and institutionalized traditional healing has emerged in pockets. Some of the Adivasi men have been able to become commercial healers and are looked upon as leaders among them. Here you see Rajamani at the center, who is one of the Adivasi women activists, a leader who has emerged from the Kudumbashri which is which is a poverty alleviation program that is being run in these hills. This is Lakshmi, who is emerging leader among them. And the far right is one of the commercial traditional healer of the region. Here I bring to you some of the voices of Adivasi women from the region. Sudha is a reserve forest watcher. She told me, nature camps were conducted in my youth. We went to the forest and lessons were conducted there. It was during 10 to 20 days of holidays for Onam and Christmas. Lessons were held on soil erosion, uses of trees. We had no other hobbies. Agriculture was our hobby. Many of those in nature camps have got government jobs. Rama, one of the Kudumbishri animators, told me, my starting point is nature. What was in my mind is nature. I used to do cultivation right from 8th standard. We used to have 5 acres those days. Now we have 3 acres which I cultivate with my son. A new line of Adivasi women, quasi-development actors have emerged. They are being trained as leaders and are mobilizing other women as part of the National Rural Livelihoods Mission. The state's NRLM implements the Kudumbishri poverty alleviation for Adivasis. This state civil society instrument is building a community cadre of women. These women are being trained in organic farming and educated on harmful effects of pesticides. They are documenting edible tubers, vegetables, fruits, and meat they consume. These women also run community kitchens. These women have the possibility to bring about Kotari's concept of radical ecological democracy. RED, or Eco-Swaraj, is an evolving framework of governance in which people and communities have access to decision-making forums based on ecological sustainability and human equity. Empirical work shows that there are 2 forms of emerging Adivasi leadership in Attapadi: quasi-development actors among the women and commercially successful healers more among the men. For a sociological understanding on leadership, we borrow from Weber on power and authority. Charismatic authority, traditional authority, and legal rationality. So let us move on to legal instruments. The dream of self-rule and letdown of Adivasi leadership. The Panchayats Act of 1996 and the Forest Rights Act of 2006 have been 2 pieces of legislation that have invested the local governance systems with enormous power. They have invested the Gram Sabha, which is the smallest village level unit, with authority over decision making on commons and other natural resources. These laws have also given rights to forest dwellers and Adivasis, both individual and collective. The Panchayats Act has been significant because it has brought together tribal customary law with the state law, and in that it is a radical piece of legislation. However, both the Panchayats Act and the Forest Rights Act are not implemented. The Western Ghats Ecology Experts Panel report recommendations have also not been followed. This panel recommended that both these pieces of legislation be implemented, vesting power with the Gram Sabhas, and it also called for a declaration of these hills as sensitive, vulnerable zones. Meanwhile, NRLM, the Livelihoods Mission, is in the process of building leadership among Attapadi's women. These Adivasi women are being mobilized to develop a political voice. This is significant as these Adivasis don't identify with Kerala's Adivasi leadership. A need has been pointed out in scholarship for an Adivasi Dalit alliance to emerge. The possible futures we can envision. My empirical work finds that ensuring land for those who have lost land with the settler influx can correct historical injustice as well as stop the continuing land dispossession that Adivasis continue to face. Brambucher and Fletcher's work on convivial conservation suggests basic conservation incomes for forest dwelling communities. Extending the state's employment guarantee scheme to forest conservation and commons is a possibility. Not just ensuring representation through legal instruments, but nurturing their erstwhile nature clubs and fostering a milieu for transformative NRM. Continuing to build emerging stewardship shown by Adivasi women as Kudumbashree leaders and quasi-development actors for eco-swaraj or radical ecological democracy. For a more conceptual understanding, this beautiful image from convivial conservation helps us see the linkages of radical ecological democracy with indigenous ideas of bon vivre living, with climate justice, degrowth, and collaboration between indigenous people and conservation. Political action for natural resource management. Bon vivre, or the good life, has always been there in indigenous imagination. This has been rekindled in Latin American countries today. Bon vivre is a form of development that sees social, cultural, environmental, and economic issues working together and in balance, not separately and hierarchically as at present. Isaiah Berlin's political action can help us further. It emerges from a sense of reality in the context. Political judgment, according to him, involves reaching an understanding of the unique set of characteristics of a situation. Such judgment is not metaphysical, but ordinary, empirical, and quasi-aesthetic. Finally, I argue for a grounded understanding of actors, as well as linking ongoing efforts in Attapadi Hills to food and climate justice movements. Thank you.
Oh, hi, Deepa. Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you.
Great. I think the connection is quite poor, but I thought it may be nice to just try to bring you up and see if there are any immediate questions so far from the audience based on your presentation. And I can bring up the other speakers as well if there aren't any immediate clarification questions. The connection is quite poor. I keep getting a lot of echo. I'm not sure if it's my connection.
The connection might be a bit bad, but I can hear you very clearly.
Okay, good. That's a good sign. Okay, in that case, I'll try to bring up. I just need to find everybody in the list here to bring up Felix and Suprana.
Yeah.
And we can see there's Felix, great, and I'll bring back up Suprana. Fantastic, thank you. So we have everybody up now, so I just wanted to open up the questions again to the audience. I know there was one outstanding from Kausa, which I'll just try to publish here. I don't know, I can't get it to publish here. Kausa is asking, I think this was directed to Felix. Kausa asks, most of the land conflicts are due to the exercise of power and authority, and sometimes the recognition have you analysed the cause of land conflict in this aspect? So regarding power and authority rather than land degradation, frustration, some of the other comments that you made about.
Sorry, I'm trying to get a question.
Can you see it on your screen? It should be there.
Yeah, I can see now. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, and that's helpful. Thank you very much. Now, you are right, and Lund was quite right that most of issues regarding land will have to do with power and issues like that. And the basic problem is not to be taken away from what is happening in the northern part of Nigeria. It's not an issue that has to do with exercise of power. Unfortunately, many people bring arguments that are unfounded. There have not been such researches in particular to show that the problem of farmers and herders in Nigeria has to do with power struggle. Of course, there could be some undertones because of the different ethnic constitution of Nigeria. And of course, we can be a little bit historical with that also. If people want to be historical and look at what happened in a place called Gurr in the north, when originally the people that today mostly are herdsmen in Nigeria, we say herders now so that we don't want to be sexist. So, but it's more appropriate in this instance to say herdsmen, because men are those that are running after the cattle in Nigeria. But for everyone, we can say herders. Now, for the herdsmen, most of them in Nigeria, they are not only Fulanis, but particularly there is a tribe, the Fulanis. They came from outside Nigeria long, long ago. So they are still part of Nigeria also, but they got to a place called Gurr and they settled there and they were living together. After a point in time, there was a jihad. They usurped authority of the old place. So, and from that history, that was how they took over the some part of the north, because they were Hausa people in the north. But the Fulani were different people. They came in, and eventually they took over. It became a power struggle in that instance. So, but it does not mean that every struggle about land has to do with power. Now, people are being historical in that sense. So when they hear of clashes between herders and farmers, they quickly think, oh, it has to do with power. They want to take over the people, they want to Islamize, they want to do this, they want to do that. I don't think all these are founded on research. They are just conjectures, maybe based on history, and rightly so. Because even after, according to history also, the Fulanis, through the jihad of Usman Dan Fodio, overran Gurr, and the emir of Gurr was dethroned. So they took over power, and they moved and they set up emirates all over the north. And they started moving to the south until they were stopped in a place called Oshogbo at the Battle of Oshogbo in 1840. And that is the southwest. So when people now see the Fulani herdsmen in the southwest, they remember also these people, this was how they took the land of some Hausa people in the north. So it could be they want to take our land also. So we understand, it is understandable that there are power struggles related to land. But those factors are not the main issues causing the conflicts between farmers and herders. What is causing it is there is desertification, there is land degradation, and land is limited. Because land is limited, farmers need land, herders need land. So they have to ration it. Now, when there is no rain, the land is arid land. Of course, people want to control. So you can still talk of power. It's power struggle also, but it's not because of power. It's because they want to survive. The farmers want to plant crops to survive economically. The herders also want to rear their cattle and be profitable. So it's economic factors, prosperity that is their problem, not power. But while trying to do that, it can translate now into, oh, it's a power struggle, but it is not because of power. That is it.
Okay, thank you, Felix. I think that answers Kaustuf's question. We have another one here from Neil Webster, which I'll try to publish here. So this is a question for Deepa. How does Deepa view Adivasi leadership in Kerala? I'm not sure if you saw Alpa Shah's keynote presentation, Deepa, but was talking about a very different type of leadership. So Neil's asking specifically about sortition in Jharkhand, but maybe more broadly as well around the kind of leadership she was proposing and illuminating for us there. Oh, you're on mute. Wait. There we go. Can we hear you? Oh. Deepa, can you hear? We're trying to get you off mute.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I just took a minute to unmute myself. Thank you very much. So, so in the leadership in Kerala is not so much around sortition that Alpa Shah refers to in her work, in terms of drawing on lots, and in terms of that sort of leadership model. Although I have to look into that a little bit more, I would say that the leadership of Adivasi leadership in Kerala is more around was a kind of charismatic leadership that evolved from land struggles. So the basis of the leadership in Kerala has been around land, but recently it is moving towards identity. And the leadership has also been the leadership, especially the charismatic one, for which
I think you've frozen, at least for me, Deepa, you've frozen. Maybe, Deepa, if you can still hear us, if you can turn the video off and just speak, that might help with bandwidth problems. I'm not sure if you can still hear us. Okay, well, maybe wait and see if Deepa is able to rejoin us. At least for me at the moment, I can't hear her, so we'll try to bring Deepa back. But she has a question here for Felix. So that was the next question. And she's asking about the methodology, Felix, for your study on land dispossession, and whether and how that methodology had a bearing on the findings.
Thank you, Deepa. Well, we did not, this study that we did was not about land dispossession. Nobody was dispossessed of land in this instance. It's only that the land was no longer productive for the purpose for which it was originally meant. Of course, we just concentrate talking about the north because that is where the problem arose, but it spread all over the other parts of Nigeria. Now, in the north, the land that was available for people to use had to be rationed between different users, herders, farmers, and other users. And long ago, land ownership resided in community leaders and families. It passed on from one generation to another. Until, of course, in 1978, when the Land Use Act came into being, and that transferred the control of land from individuals to the government. So if you talk of land possession or dispossession in terms of that, well, this study was not about that. Our study was about discovering why there was conflict and if there was a nexus to determine what if there was a relationship between those conflicts between farmers and herdsmen and leadership. So I hope that answers your question. So it wasn't about dispossession of land in this instance. So, but the methodology that we used in...
okay, great.
Okay. Did I answer?
I'm not sure if it's my connection or it's a bit slow. I think we have Deepa back, but Deepa, can you hear us? There's a question here for Deepa. I just want to wait and see if Deepa can hear us. Does anybody have a question for Suprana whilst we try to bring Deepa back? Because I'm not sure she can hear us at the moment. There's another question here. That one's, sorry, that one's for Felix. I was just trying to see if there were other questions here. I think, oh, no, Julian's just gone. I'll fill it. Okay, fine. I have, Deepa's back, I think. Yeah, so there's, I'll just get rid of, there's a question here for Deepa. I'm not sure if your connection is okay there, Deepa. The question from Philip Hadley is, do you know if the new cadre of Adivasi women leaders has changed how the community will get involved in other development projects? So that might allow you as well to just finish the point that you were making.
I would say that in my empirical study, the main development project that is being run there is state and civil society interaction. So this is called the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, and it is run on a state civil society model. So this kind of Adivasi women here in my study are able to some extent bring about some kind of change in their neighborhoods, in their among their own villages, and they are beginning to exercise some a kind of role and a kind of leadership within this model. So within this state civil society, civil state partnership.
Deepa, you keep breaking up for us. I don't know if you can hear me. Would you be able to try without the video? Sorry, can you try without the video, because it might make
I just switched it off.
We're running out. We just have a few minutes left, so we'll try to see if you can answer that.
So I was responding to the question on how whether Adivasi women can be part of the development programs. From if I understood that question, and I would say that the development model that is being currently run, in which the Adivasi women have had a share in stewardship, is a state civil society partnership, and this current development program has been able to mobilize and train these women. So in the state civil society partnership, the Adivasi women are able to intervene and are able to bring about and are able to intervene and use the development to be able to use the development for themselves and for the community. The state civil society partnership is a model that is working in my study. This has been working. While some of the earlier development programs have not worked, and that has largely been because these people, the Adivasi community, was not involved to an extent that they're involved today.
That's great, thank you. And that makes the change that you mentioned from being wage labourers to further involvement in the partnership. That's great, thank you. We're running out of time here now, so what I'd suggest maybe is, because you had your hand up or a question anyway, Isaac, that you just arrange to speak with Felix. I think you can send an instant message on this so that you can continue the other conversation as well. So I'd just like to thank all of the speakers. Thank you for bearing with us with some of the technical issues as well. It's been nice to see some leadership discussions here that maybe contrast a little bit with the keynote speaker, but then also certainly with Soprana's and Deepa's presentation seem to also align somewhat. So there's lots of discussion, I'm sure, there about the forms of leadership in the different contexts that we can continue with. So this panel continues at 2 o'clock. I think that's right, in session 8 this afternoon, when we have 3 more speakers talking about Nepal, about Ghana, and Emmanuel about interactions between traditional and modern institutions in Ghana as well. So hopefully see you all back here at 2 o'clock. I think there's a short break now, and then the AGM at 11:15, where everybody is welcome to attend. Great, thank you very much for your questions and thoughts, and hopefully see you all this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the second session of the Leadership in and for Natural Resource Management. As I was just saying, we've got 3 presentations scheduled for this afternoon, but at the moment we've only located 2 of the presenters. I'm Fiona Noonan, and I'm convening this panel with Claire Barnes and Brock Basalio, who are just on the platforms with me. We were representing the Environment, Natural Resources and Climate Change Study Group of the DSA. So please do have a look at our study group page on the new DSA website to find out more about the group, and drop me an email if you'd like to join our mailing list and start planning future activities and collaborations. So without further ado, our first presentation by Gustav Raj Nupani on the role of local leadership for making Dhulikhel town of Nepal water secured through formalizing water agreements is a recording, but Gustav is here, so we'll show his recording and then we'll bring him up to answer any questions. So please do put your questions in the questions area, and we'll have time for questions as well after his presentation. You can use the raised hands tab there, and do remember that if you're having any problems, any technical problems, to put your question in the text chat, and Johan will do his best to provide any support that you might need. But otherwise, I look forward to some questions and discussions later on.
Hi, this is Gustav Raj Nupani, and I'll be presenting today role of local leadership of Dhulikhel town of Nepal for making it water secured. Currently, I'm recording this presentation on the 71st day of restricted lockdown in my home country, Nepal, in this crisis situation. You may think that Nepal, a Himalayan country, might be rich in water resources, but we having adequate amount of water, but we feel we are having a water scarcity, and local leadership brings a case. This case of Dhulikhel shows that how local leadership has been negotiating with the upstream community to make water secure. Talking about community governance of Nepal, Nepal has a long history of community managed governance system, particularly in forest and water, and it has been also well established that local participation and long-term and empowerment has been key for success of governance for sustainable management at the of the natural resources. However, recently in Nepal, they have been greatly challenged. Community institutions or local institutions have been challenged by with the heightened experience of fear of natural scarcity. And in this similar scenario, we will be examining these dynamics through Dhulikhel drinking water supply project, which is perceived one of the most successful community governed drinking project in this region of not only Nepal, in this whole South Asian region. And particularly this has been successful in case they were successful in negotiating with the upstream community, and the project itself sources the water through with agreements between upstream rural community and the downstream and the town in the downstream. The aim of this paper will be to explore how Dhulikhel leadership of Nepal have overcome water insecurity and their different management strategy to control our local resources and their effective provision and strategies for water security. Talking about methodology, where this is more on qualitative research approach. We have used green literature, some qualitative data, primary data were collected particularly through local people interviews, drinking water use committee, stakeholder consultations, and field trips were organized. And talking about Dhulikhel city, it is a hilltop city and it is a dominant of Newar community, and it is a historic trade route of Nepal and Tibet, and it is home of around 17,000 people and it is a touristic town with more than 50 hotels, and being very close to Kathmandu, it is getting urbanizing rapidly, and it also serves as the headquarters of Kabre district. And talking about history of water management of Dhulikhel, actually it is divided into two ways. One prior to the 1990s of the German project, which is currently supplying water to the town, and the previous one, and the new project, which is currently supplying water to around 2600 household, is called as German, even referred as a new system or German project, because it was constructed with the support of GTZ. And while establishment of this institution, it is managed currently by the Dhulikhel Drinking Water Users Committee, and it is the first community managed drinking water supply system in Nepal, because in the initial days, this Water Users Committee was set up with the Decentralization Act 1981, and later on Water Resource Act. In most of the Water Users Committee, where we have more than 45,000 Water Users Committee in Nepal, they have been established under the new act only. So this can be called as a pioneer water users community managed water committee. And now particularly we will be dealing with the new water supply system with the GTZ and the negotiation done by this GTZ project with the upstream community. As I mentioned, the upstream community was the Bhumidara BDC, and downstream was Dhulikhel village panchayat. And while having this negotiation, the Bhumidara, the people from Dhulikhel, they went to the upstream community, they requested for water, and they took, Dhulikhel people took, as being a district headquarters, they took their friend who used to chair the district, chairman of Kafre district panchayat, and they requested, along with them, they visited to the upstream community, requested for water, and in demand of that, the upstream community requested to support them for the construction of a school building, which was destroyed by the flood of the upstream river. And finally, the negotiation was successful, and Dhulikhel supported in the construction of a school. And after that, in ad hoc basis, repeatedly the upstream people negotiated with the Dhulikhel Water Users Committee, which managed the water in the downstream, and it has paid around already 80,000 USD, nearly equivalent 80,000 USD has been paid to the upstream community by the Water Users Committee. And the water that was brought to Dhulikhel town was supplied to the limited wards called ward number 2, 3, and 4, and which was the previously Dhulikhel Panchayat. Later, Dhulikhel merged the surrounding BDC to make itself as the municipality, but water was supplied only to the previous Dhulikhel village panchayat. The key learning of the first agreement, having analysis, what we feel that the first agreement was based on the interpersonal relationship between the leaders of upstream and the downstream community, and along with there was material support that was in understanding, or that was in a mutual understanding, that on the basis of need, that agreement was established. And similarly, the Bhumidara people, why they agreed was that they had to visit district headquarters, which was Dhulikhel town, to get other facilities to get either citizenship card or other official work. They had to visit headquarters, and they need to, and that was that also helped. The core thing behind having this agreement was that water was considered as a social good, and sharing water as a spiritual deed was a crucial factor for underlying the agreement. But as the town grew on, as Dhulikhel town grew on, the demand of water grew on in the downstream community, and again Dhulikhel had no any other option than going back to the same BDC, same upstream region, for new negotiation for supplying water to the town. Particularly, the second agreement was planned to supply water to the peripheral region of Dhulikhel, or the water supply to the Dhulikhel municipality. Some wards were deprived from the water from the previous project, so Dhulikhel was having water scarcity, and there was protest going in the downstream. So Dhulikhel leadership had no any other option than going back to the upstream. So they came up with a new project supported by the Asian Development Bank, and they signed a new agreement for the new project. At the moment of this agreement, particularly Nepal didn't have a local elected representative, and so most of the work was done by the technocrats or the bureaucrats at the BDC level, who were backed up by the political leaders of the town as well as the upstream community. So finally agreement was made, and Dhulikhel agreed to provide around 62,000 USD over 5-year period of time as incentive to the upstream community, as well as there was support in the subsidy in the treatment at Dhulikhel Hospital, scholarship at the Kathmandu University, and so on. But people were unhappy. In the upstream, people were not happy of all these agreements because they think that the amount that is coming back to the BDC, that has been spread to the different parts. Not only this, they think that amount that has incentives has come to amount has to be spent on their area rather than spreading to other part of the upstream. And there were whole graffiti going on, protest going on. You can see in this image, it says that please do not only demand water, please give us development. I think this was in the upstream community. It shows that this agreement was done at the higher political level. The whole cause of conflict was on that, and the success, or the key success, was because there was a pre-existing social connection between the political leaders. And political leaders, they belong to the same political parties. They used to meet a lot of time, but the town leaders were more powerful. They had an unequal power position than the village leadership. That was one of the things. And the next issue was that the political as in the earlier narration, that the political leaders in the upstream or the locals were unhappy about the distribution amount of the incentive amount. That was the reason of conflict. And next was that I think the next the grievance among the water users are gives that there is a conflict between water provider communities and for water sharing. This comes with the second agreement, and this is finally the third agreement done till date by Dhulikhel with the upstream Bhuminana community to make water secure for Dhulikhel. And this was more or less similar, and this was done by the Dhulikhel Drinking Water Supply Project, or the German funded project, which was managed currently by the community. And because they had paid more than a huge amount to the upstream community on ad hoc basis, so they want to formalize the agreement and make the payment incentive amount in a more managed way. So they had paid around they made an agreement, and the agreement was done in the presence of the powerful institution like Dhulikhel Hospital, Kathmandu University, and they paid around 800,000 Nepali rupees and similar to on annual basis. And during this agreement, what we saw that the social values associated with the water was eroded, and the monetary or the material incentives in the water sharing agreements were clearly manifested. I think this also came related with the growing demand from the upstream community. And similarly, the local powerful institution were the crucial institution. They had a credibility in the dialogue. So the negotiation for the long term came into was formally finalized. This is the case of Delhi Hell. Third agreement, and the contestation was going on, but in Nepal in 2015, Nepal observed a larger earthquake, and that earthquake saw drastic change in the Nepalese politics. And we had new Nepal adopted a new constitution after the earthquake, and we had Nepal gone to the polls after 20 years. There were local representatives in the town, and with the elected bodies, people thought that the conflict as a political body have a very powerful authority to manage the issue, and they had strength, and they have been quite successful till this date. And talking about this issue, issue, as the Delhi Khel and the upstream both upstream downstream got elected representative, the negotiation has been more institutionalized. And currently, the Delhi Khel mayor, recently on a meeting around 3 months back, he proposed an idea of water council as authorized institutional body that can deal with that has emerged as a governance mechanism for dealing water-related issues or managing upstream and downstream communities, where there will be representative of both upstream and downstream, and that will manage everything as a negotiate in a way. I think this shows that the changes over the with the change in the political situation, new type of governance mechanism come up, or they have been institutionalized. Prior to the elected body, it was more led by the community, and community leadership were successful after having elected body. A new form of governance mechanism have come up with. Talking particularly in case of the Delhi Khel, the mayor, who is currently mayor of Delhi Khel, he was one of the key persons, key signatory in the past, and he himself claims that the success or he was elected in the election because he was a prime he was a key people to deal with the water negotiation and make Delhi Khel water secure. I think that gives a window, or we can say that the community leader in the past have been established as a political leader in case of Delhi Khel, in case of water. Now, finally summarizing the whole presentation, we could see that the negotiation and the formal agreement of these natural resources were guided by social, political context and the leadership. And as the socio-political landscape and pressure change, that maintain or contest the stability of water agreements, or they challenge the water agreements. Similarly, this post-earthquake governance has formalized pre-existing community initiatives through reintroduction of the democratic election. As I mentioned, similarly, in natural resource regulation, we can say that long-term security and scarcity gives a certain crisis. Provide windows for new leadership. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay,
Just,
so are there any, thank you very much for that presentation and for recording it so well, etc. Are there any questions from anyone?
Can I ask a question, or is that cheeky?
No, you can declare. You're very welcome.
Thank you. I couldn't work out how to do it with the buttons here. Thanks. Thank you, Castor. I just wanted to ask, just because I've heard you talk a little bit on this before, and something that I find really fascinating was about how water is seen as a social good, and whether you think, and how you think that really influences the discussions, and whether that maybe makes it easier for the mayor as a leader when everybody sees water as being something that is a social good, and therefore has a shared understanding and maybe appreciation of water as a resource.
I think this was quite even interesting case for us. In the past, usually people, as you know, I'm not sure I can reply your answer correctly, but what I feel that the way of social good in the past was a case, but later on, as the social good, as water is not perceived as more as case of social good. So in the initial days, as if you see globally about negotiation of in the water as a if you see from the ecological economics perspective, as the idea of payment for environmental services, there has the service. I think it has moved to the more. I'm having issue with my internet. I could only hear the broken.
No problem at all, Castor. Don't worry if the connection.
Yeah. Okay, are there any other questions from anyone? Otherwise, we'll go on to the next presentation, and if a question does occur to you, there'll be time to ask questions after that. Right. So I'm going to bring Isaac up. Hi, Isaac. Are you okay?
Hi. Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you. Thank you.
So Isaac, maybe you could say a few words about yourself as I just find your presentation, and then I'll upload it.
You mean I should introduce myself?
Yes, please. Yeah, I know you're at London School of Economics, but you can say a little bit more about yourself.
Oh, okay. So obviously my name is Isaac, but my other names are Haruna and Ziaba. So I am a third year currently PhD student with the International Development Department of the London School of Economics, and my research looks into the governance of artisanal and small-scale mining. So I mean, this afternoon, that is what it's all about for me, presenting to you the kind of leadership in the governance of artisanal and small-scale mining, and explaining the variation in this leadership over time.
Okay, that's great. So I'll give you, you have about 20 minutes or so, and I'll let you know if there's any danger if you're overrunning, and we'll have some time for questions after that. So over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, so like I said, that's my name and that's my school and department. And so I present to you my work titled Strain Relations, the Ghanaian State and Artisanal and Small-Scale Miners. Next slide. So in this presentation, you're going to look at the conceptualization of ASM, that is artisanal and small-scale mining for short. You look at the puzzle and the research question. We look at the research method. The literature review will follow. We will then look into the main theoretical argument. I will then look at the alternative theoretical argument. I will problematize alternative explanation to the research questions. And then I will look into the main argument or explanation. I will then conclude by looking at the theoretical and policy implication of this research, but also highlighting areas for future research. Next slide, please. So artisanal and small-scale mining, or ASM, has been defined as a labor-intensive economic activity that involves few entry barriers and occurring mostly in the gold industry. Some scholars see artisanal small-scale mining as a criminal activity or an illegal activity, but I conceptualize it more as an informal economic activity. And I see it as an informal economic activity because even though the process of production is illicit or illegal, the final product, which could be gold or diamond or tanzanite or whatever, is licit and it is traded to licensed gold dealers. So that makes artisanal small-scale mining an informal economy rather than an illegal economy. Next slide, please. So a lot of scholars have kind of, overlooked the categorization of ASM, which I think is a bit unfortunate because ASM comes in different types and different forms. And so I think it is important we understand the various categories of ASM. So in this 3x3 table, I'm going to present to you the various categories of ASM. So the column will tell you the ASM type, whereas the row will show you the ASM form. So the first category would then be the line-cyst ASM type and the alluvial ASM form, which tends to be capital intensive and occurs adjacent river bodies with grave negative environmental externalities. The next category would be the line-cyst ASM type and the hard rock ASM form, which tends to be labor intensive and occurs adjacent large-scale mining or LSM concessions. Concession here means a parcel of land, but can also involve trivial negative environmental externalities. We have the third category, which is the unlicensed ASM type and the alluvial ASM form, which tends to be capital intensive and occurs within or adjacent river bodies, but has a lot of negative environmental externalities. And finally, we have the category that is, made up of the unlicensed ASM type and the hard rock ASM form. This is characterized by labor intensiveness, but this kind of mining occurs within or adjacent LSM concessions, and it comes with trivial negative externalities. So I present these pictures to you to give you some kind of pictorial sense of the different forms of ASM. So on the far right-hand side, the picture over there is an example of a hard rock mining, and the rest of the pictures on the left-hand side and the middle are examples of alluvial mining. However, the one in the middle is an alluvial mining that is occurring on the water body, whereas the other one on the left-hand side is an alluvial mining that is not occurring on a water body, but close to a water body. Next slide, please. So, as some of us may already be aware, there are some positive economic outcomes of ASM despite the environmental degradation or externalities. And so scholars have noted the employment prospects in the ASM sector, and some 40 million people are globally estimated to be employed in the sector. In Africa, about 8.21 million people are directly employed in the ASM sector, and the figure for Ghana stands at approximately 1 million people. And there are some forward and backward economic linkages associated with the ASM sector. And more importantly, ASM contributes to domestic resource mobilization efforts of various countries. And so I present to you this graph on Ghana to give you a sense of the contribution of ASM to total gold production over a period of 20 years. So as you can see, the blue line, which represents the contribution of ASM, suggests that over the last couple of years, ASM share to total gold production has been increasing, and therefore government has been making more money from ASM. Next slide, please. So obviously, as I've shown you in the previous slide, ASM has some kind of economic viability, but scholars have argued that the sector is neglected in Africa. And in the Ghanaian case, for example, there is tense relations between the Ghanaian state more generally and the ASM sector. And to be more specific, since 2006, we have witnessed 3 successive but largely failed clampdowns on the ASM sector. So in 2006, when the New Patriotic Party, NPP, was in power under President Kufuor, we witnessed what we call Operation Flushout. This was an example of a clampdown exercise.
However, between 2008 and 2012, when the National Democratic Congress, the NDC, was in power under President Mills, we did not witness any clampdown exercise at all. But in 2013, for a period of a month, the same NDC government, under a different leader by name President Mahama, introduced a similar clampdown exercise called Operation Hot. And in 2017, under the NPP, again, but this time round under a different political leader by name President Akufo-Addo, we witnessed about, I think, 3 years of clampdown exercise called Operation Vanguard. So what is interesting about the management of the ASM sector in this regard is that there is some kind of longitudinal or temporal variation in clampdown exercises. And I think it is interesting to explore or explain that. Next slide, please. So this map actually tells you how ASM varies across space. So in the northern part of the country, ASM is predominantly hard rock. In the southern part of the country, ASM is predominantly alluvial. But as you can see, ASM seems to be occurring more in the south than it does occur in the north. The yellow dot here represents gold deposit. However, clampdown exercises are limited to the south. So this gives us a sense of spatial or geographical variation in the way political leaders manage or govern the ASM sector. So this kind of backdrop gives rise to the questions: why does the Ghanaian state often clamp down on ASM despite the failure that greets each clampdown exercise? I think it is also more importantly crucial to explain why there is temporal and spatial variation in clampdown exercises. So these are the research questions that this study seeks to explore or explain. Next slide, please. So in terms of the method, very quickly, this is a qualitative research. I triangulate data via semi-structured interview. Interviewed mining companies, government ministries and agencies in charge of mineral resource management. I had a discussion with ASM operatives and communities and civil society organizations at the national and subnational levels, respectively. I also did participate in mining conferences where I had the opportunity to have random discussion with ASM operatives sampled across the country. I then drew heavily on gray data and official documents from mining companies and government of agencies as well. And in terms of the analysis, I rely on what is called process tracing, discourse, and test analysis. Next slide, please. So before I go even into the theory and my main argument, alternative argument, it is important we know what the literature says about the management of informal economy more broadly. And my review of the literature points to a binary kind of literature on how states manage their informal economies. The first is the capacity question, and that argues that whether or not states would kind of, enforce their regulation against their informal economies depends on their capacity to do so. And the second literature is about the political question. And here the argument is that political survival defines whether or not states would enforce their regulations against the informal economy. As we will see later, my argument will kind of build on the latter kind of literature, which is the political question literature, much to the neglect of the first literature. Shall we move on? The next slide. So in terms of my main theoretical argument, I rely heavily on the political settlement theory and the political marketplace theory. The political settlement theory basically says that the distribution of political power across competing political elites and the logic of political survival would invariably shape policy outcomes, right? Whereas with regard to the political marketplace, the argument is that politicians are in the market to maximize their votes through two mechanisms. So the first one is the market for money or the political budget thesis, and the second one is the market for votes. So the market for money argues that politicians are in the market to galvanize or mobilize enough resources in terms of money, which obviously will be needed in campaign in order to maximize their political fortunes. Whereas the market for votes argues that politicians are in the market to obviously mobilize more votes and therefore are more likely than not to implement policies that would increase their chances of winning more votes. Next slide, please. However, I want to also look at alternative theoretical argument that could help us make sense of the research question that I highlighted. So the first alternative theoretical argument would be that a state's enforcement capacity and the diseconomies or the disadvantages associated with an informal activity will lead to a criminalization or clamp down on that particular informal economic activity. Whereas the second alternative theoretical argument would be that there is some kind of linkages between the political ideology of a political party and the kind of policy they implement. So generally, leftist parties or socialist-oriented parties would kind of tolerate informal economies, whereas capitalist-oriented parties, such as rightist parties, may generally criminalize on the informal economy. Shall we move on, please? Next slide, please. Okay, so here I kind of try to problematize the alternative argument and say that they don't really help us in making sense of the research questions that this research is about to speak to. So the first alternative argument would then be that Ghana's relative enforcement capacity and the diseconomies or the disadvantages associated with ASM incentivize clamp down exercises. Ghana actually has a 2020 World Justice Project Index score of 0.57 and ranks 51 out of 128 countries. So the WJP index actually measures governance along, I think, about 8 dimensions, including regulatory enforcement. So a score of 0.57 and a rank of 51 out of 128 countries suggests that Ghana pretty much had the capacity to enforce its regulations. So maybe that in addition to the diseconomies associated with ASM may help us understand why over the period of time we've seen the Ghanaian government or state clamping down or criminalizing ASM as an informal economy. The problem with this alternative argument is that it does not explain spatial and temporal variation in clamp down exercise. If Ghana does have the capacity to enforce its regulation, why is it that between 2008 and 2012, we did not see any clamp down? Is it that government did not have the capacity, the enforcement capacity at that point in time? Why is it that even from 2013 to 2017, we see some kind of variation in the way political leaders clamp down on the ASM sector? So that is the problem with this alternative argument. The second alternative argument would be the one that argues that, okay, the different political orientations or ideologies of the NDC and the NPP explain different degrees of clamp down on ASM. I think this alternative argument kind of comes close to doing the job. However, the argument is that the NDC is a socialist party or a social democrat, and therefore we would generally expect the NDC to kind of tolerate ASM. And that might explain why between 2008 and 2012, when the NDC was in power, they did not clamp down on ASM. Whereas the NPP tends to clamp down very harshly on the ASM sector because of the NPP's capitalist or rightist ideology. I think the problem with this alternative argument is that it cannot explain why President Mills tolerated ASM, whereas President Mahama clamped down on ASM, even though they both president superintended over the same leftist political party, the NDC. So this is also a problem, making this alternative argument kind of, spurious. Shall we move on? Next slide. So I then move on to my main argument that says that Ghana's competitive political settlement explains spatial and temporal variation in clamp down exercises. In other words, the fact that Ghana has a quasi two-party competitive political system can help us understand why over time and across space, clamp down measures differ. And so a curious mind will want to understand the mechanisms or the processes through which through which a competitive political system on one hand can explain clamp down exercises over time and across space. And so I suggest that differences in media-induced ASM discourse would, together with differences in ASM-induced campaign finance, generally provide competing political elites with differential incentives to clamp down on the ASM. I unpack this mechanism into 4 different scenarios so that we are able to understand the conditions under which we will be able to expect a particular form of clamp down measure. So the first scenario would argue that a low media-induced ASM discourse, together with low ASM-induced campaign finance, should produce an intense clamp down measure. And the reasoning is because the market for votes and the market for money in ASM become unimportant to incumbents. The second scenario would be that a low media-induced ASM discourse together with high ASM-induced campaign finance and diseconomies should lead to no clampdown measure. And the reason is because the market for votes and the market for money in ASM become important to political incumbents. Next slide, please. The third scenario would be that a moderate involvement of the media in ASM discourse together with a high ASM-induced rent or campaign finance should lead us to expect a moderate but politically targeted clampdown measure. And this is because the market for votes in ASM becomes moderately important, whereas the market for money in ASM becomes important. And finally, a high media-induced ASM discourse together with a high ASM-induced rent or campaign finance should lead us to expect an intense but politically targeted clampdown measure. And the reason is because the market for votes in ASM becomes unimportant for incumbents. However, the market for money in ASM becomes hugely important. Next slide, please. So I know the argument I've just, talked about or highlighted in the previous slide might appear to be a bit complicated. So I present this 6x6 kind of, table to simplify it. So in 2006, for example, when the NPP was in power, we saw a very intense clampdown measure. And the reason is that the media's involvement in ASM discourse was low, but the campaign finance prospect or the money the political party at the time could expect from ASM was quite low. And so the importance of ASM votes was very, very low. And therefore, the incumbents at the time did not have any political incentive to tolerate ASM, and hence it clamped down heavily on ASM. Contrast that with NDC between 2008 and 2012, where we don't see any clampdown at all. And the reason is because the media's involvement in ASM discourse, even though it was low, the campaign finance prospects or the amount of money or range the NDC was expecting to get from the ASM sector was quite high. And therefore, the importance of ASM votes was high. And so we saw no clampdown. The NDC did not have any political incentive to clamp down on ASM this time round. Compare that to the same party, NDC, in 2013, where we saw a moderate but politically targeted clampdown measure. And the reason for that is because the media's involvement in ASM discourse was quite moderate. But at the same time, the rent or money or campaign finance in ASM was quite high. And so the importance of ASM votes was moderate. Hence, we saw a moderate but politically targeted clampdown measure. And it was politically targeted because the incumbent did it this way in order to prevent the opposition from getting resources from the ASM sector. And finally, we see in 2017, the NPP government introduced an intense but politically targeted clampdown measure. And the explanation is that in 2017, the media's involvement in ASM discourse was very high. At the same time that the ASM-induced campaign finance or rent was also high. And so the importance of ASM votes became very low. And therefore, the government had every political incentive to clamp down heavily on ASM in a political way or a partisan way. This way, the incumbent government was able to prevent the opposition from getting access to resources from the ASM sector. So this kind of political threat to regime survival creates different incentives for different political leaders to govern the ASM sector in quite different ways. Next slide, please. So to conclude, in terms of theoretical implication, I think my research on the way political leaders govern the ASM sector throws more light on the fact that power distribution across competing elites shapes distinct development outcomes, as we've seen. And in terms of policy implication, I know that the World Bank, I think in 2013, demonstrated a lot of interest in wanting to formalize the ASM sector. But I would recommend that any attempt by development partners to support developing countries to effectively manage their ASM sectors must take into consideration the power distribution upon which every state is based. And finally, this research focuses on only Ghana, and it shows how Ghana's political settlement shapes development outcomes with regard to the ASM sector. And so I think in the future, a comparative analysis on state ASM interactions will be very, very useful. With this said, I would like to thank you and end here and welcome your comments, suggestions, and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isaac. That was fascinating. And I'm sure we'll have some questions for that. So please do raise your hands or type a question. Right, so we'll just give people a few minutes. Any questions from anyone? Well, perhaps I can ask a question as we're waiting. So I was wondering, Isaac, whether how your case compares to any others that you found in the literature in terms of the sort of political incentives for clamping down on artisanal and small-scale mining. So perhaps or
yeah, thanks for the question. I think the reason why I decided to do a political economy analysis of the ASM sector is that there's been virtually limited study, political economy study on the ASM sector. So I found a very important gap in that regard, you know, to do this research. However, I think in terms of political forces underlying ASM policy measures, I think one scholar by name Faru Abdullahi has done quite a similar work on Ghana. But then I think his argument was that ASM votes matter at all times. And that is why politicians are unable to kind of, you know, address the menace associated with the ASM sector. However, I find a problem with that kind of argument because I don't think ASM votes matter at all times. I think they matter at some times, and in other times they don't matter. When the vote of ASM operatives matter, politicians would kind of implement policies that tolerate ASM. If the vote of ASM operatives don't matter, politicians would implement policies that criminalize on ASM. And that is why between 2008 and 2012, when the vote of ASM operatives did matter, the President Mills at the time did tolerate ASM, compared to 2017, when the media raised issues on environmental degradation associated with the ASM sector, and therefore made the ASM sector unpopular. Obviously, the political party found that the ASM vote will not be important, because if you implement a policy that will tolerate ASM, what it means is that you don't care about the larger voting public. And that probably explains why in 2017, the government clamped down on ASM, despite ASM constituting an important electoral constituency.
Well, that sounds fascinating. I think in my own area of work within fisheries, I think how politics and votes and elections affect enforcement mechanisms and timing, etc. Some parallels there as well. Any other? So we've got some time for further questions. If you have any questions for Gustav as well, we can take those and bring him back onto the platform if there are any questions for him. And I just want to double check. I'm not aware that we have located the third presenter. So unless I hear otherwise from Claire or Johan, or anyone's found him, then we'll have to assume that we've just got the two presentations this afternoon. Okay, so I don't think we've got any further questions. So I'm just going to. Oh, we've got Claire. Have you got a question, Claire, or are you?
Yeah, no, I do. If that's all right. I just, without knowing the context at all, I was wondering if you could explain a bit more about why the media discourses themselves are changing. So I'm not really sure of kind of the reasons behind these shifting discourses. So you mentioned about environmental issues sometimes being more on the agenda than at other times, and that influencing the politicians' perspective of what they can do in terms of getting elected and what their incentives are. So I wondered if you could explain a bit more about what is it actually that shifts the media discourse and how that interrelates with the incentives of the different politicians you mentioned?
Yeah, so if I got your question right, I think the shifting in media discourses actually kind of, could be explained by the relative diseconomies associated with the ASM sector. So in 2006, for example, there was, if you like, zero media discourse on artisan and small-scale mining. And that is because in 2006, ASM in Ghana was predominantly hard rock. And as I indicated to you in the earlier slides, hard rock is associated with very trivial environmental degradation. So that doesn't quite capture the media's attention. However, after 2006, I think the Ghanaian government sent some artisan miners to China to learn efficient, production of gold. Now, in China, what happens there is predominantly alluvial ASM. When these miners came back, the knowledge and the skills they gathered was not amenable to hard rock mining. So most of them went into alluvial mining. Now, at that same time, the price for gold was increasing over time. Remember, there was global financial crisis at the time. And so a lot of people, there was some kind of gold rush. And the gold rush happened a lot in the alluvial mining sector because obviously it is easier to extract gold in alluvial mining compared to hard rock mining. So from 2008 upwards, we saw a gradual increase in the involvement of people in alluvial mining. That still didn't capture the attention of the media because we had yet to see the environmental externalities quite clearly. It was from 2013 upward that the media's attention was brought to the environmental externalities caused by alluvial mining predominantly, and they decided to engage with ASM discourse. And that explains why the government at the time, NDC, kind of moved quickly to implement a moderate clampdown policy on ASM. And when I was speaking to, I think, the minister in charge, the former minister in charge of lands and natural resources, his argument is that one key reason why they terminated that particular clampdown measure within a period of a month is because they didn't get the support of the media, presupposing that because there wasn't much media discourse, any attempt to clamp down on ASM will make you an enemy of ASM, which is nevertheless an important electoral constituency. And these people are more likely to vote against you in the next election. So in the paper that I'm writing, I show some kind of descriptive statistics to suggest that in the 2016 election, the incumbent government lost very massively in all ASM constituencies in Ghana. And that is because of that moderate clampdown that happened in 2013. So you can imagine if they had gone all out against ASM in 2013, they would have lost very, very, very massively in the 2016 election. So the media discourse changes over time because of the relative diseconomy of ASM over time.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for the explanation.
Great. That's it's fascinating, isn't it? We'll all look out for your the publications coming out of your PhD then, and wish you all the very best in completing your PhD. And thank you for your presentation. Thank you, Gustav, too, for your presentation this afternoon, and for all our presenters from this morning. I think if it's okay with you, Brock, I'll just bring you up so we can see you and we can just close this session. So you're muted, Brock, but just to say thank you for coming this afternoon. And as I said at the beginning of the session, please do look up the study group, the Environment, Natural Resources and Climate Change Study Group. Have a look at the page on the DSA website, and please send me an email if you'd like to join the mailing list. And we're very open to suggestions for activities. We intend to hold some online workshops and events during the course of the next year. We always like to encourage collaborations between members, whether that's on panel proposals for other conferences, writing, research even would be great to see. So please do get involved, and we look forward to collaboration. Any final words from Brock or Claire?
Just to thank everyone, including Claire and Fiona, for doing a very good job organizing and convening this digitally. So thank you, everyone. Virtual clap.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And thank you, Johan, as well, who's been great in the background there.
Yeah, Johan as well, yeah. All
on track. Yeah. And I'm sorry that we lost our last presenter. I really don't know what happened to him. So he hasn't replied to our emails. So maybe next time. So thank you all very much. And so we finished a little bit early this afternoon. And so I wish you a very good weekend. And I hope you've enjoyed the conference.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.